As usual, they've saved the best until last, and that's going to be on the other stage with Crespo and Deco in about 20 minutes. Until then, I will keep you entertained as best I can on the 5 changing trends in China's sports digital landscape. So, China, for most clubs, for most organizations, is either the #1 or 2 priority market internationally. And the main reason for this is either the size and the speed of change in this market. Most of you are familiar with the size, huge figures, astronomical fees being paid for rights, for players' transfers, and an enormous population. So today I want to focus on the speed, and more importantly, the speed of change. This is a picture of Shanghai 25 years ago in 1990, and it really has no relevance to this presentation apart from the fact that it's a great picture and it shows how much the skyline has changed. If you take this construction changes and you apply it to the digital revolution that's happened, that has been much faster and much more dramatic in a much shorter period of time. In the early 2000s, China had 40 million people online, and for a country of 1.3 billion, that is a tiny percentage. So the change in the growth that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years has been dramatic. And today there are just over 1 billion people online in China. I arrived to set up Mailman's sports business 8 years ago, and our first assignment was Liverpool's Guangzhou tour in 2011. And back then, Liverpool were a pretty forward-thinking team. They had an international content strategy. They had teams in different markets, but still absolutely nothing in China. And this is only 7 years ago. So we set them up as the very first team to use Weibo and set up an official account catered only to Chinese people. Since then, a hell of a lot has changed, and over the next 7 or 8 years, there's been broadcast changes, fan culture changes, trends, and behavioral changes. I'm going to run through a few of them. The current youth in China skipped the PC generation and went straight to mobile. They grew up with a tablet or a screen in their hands. If you compare Facebook to China's social usage, 93% of daily active users use mobile to access social media. It's about half that in Facebook. There's so-called social media addiction, meaning that millennials in China spend about 2 hours using a social media app, consuming content on a digital platform every single day. It's an e-commerce crazy market. It's the #1 commerce market in the world. You just look at the stats that come out of Singles Day to determine how important this is to the country's economy. On November 11th every year, there's a crazy boost in the amount of revenue that comes in, with $25 billion being spent last year on a single day. It's one of the most forward-thinking cultures in the world when it comes to innovation in mobile payments. If you spend any time in China, you will be fully aware that most people don't carry around a wallet. Either Alipay or WeChat Pay suffice in terms of making daily payments, paying your rent, buying food at the markets, sending money, splitting the bill. I very rarely carry a wallet, so it's a bit of a shock when you go home. Broadcast. You've seen crazy roller coaster of rights being sub-licensed, bought and sold for varying fees. You've seen the rise and fall of, at one stage, Le Sports, who were the biggest rights holder in the world. They carried more individual premium sports content matches or content pieces than anyone else in the world, and today they barely exist. And over that same time frame, you saw PPTV struggling 2 years ago to compete in any form with the astronomical fees being paid. Today are the majority owner of most of the European football rights. This is how the landscape looks, with PP controlling most of that football space, CCTV taking back the League One rights, and more recently DDMC buying back the La Liga rights. So no one's safe. It changes year on year. It practically changes every 6 months. Tencent have a bit more of a holistic, wider sports view. They take the top the top US sports rights. They take the tennis rights, the golf rights. So their focus is a little wider. Social media, which is coming to a little bit more of the topic of today. If we look 7 years ago, some of the key social platforms were QQ, were Renren, and even Tencent Weibo. Now, 2 of those cease to exist today, but you'll still see clubs quoting their Tencent Weibo numbers, which, to put it in perspective, would be like Manchester United talking about a MySpace following. QQ today really exists as a desktop P2P messaging platform. As the years went on, Weibo and WeChat rose to prominence, and we've talked a lot about that over the last 2 days. But what I want to focus on is some of the newer platforms. You have Yijibo coming into prominence as the #1 mobile live streaming platform integrated into Weibo. On the right of that, you have Jinri Toutiao, a kind of aggregated daily headline app with now over 1 billion views per day. Douyin, people talked about in the club's panel earlier today, 15-second UGC-focused video platform. And then finally, Dongchodi, so a vertical football-only app with much smaller numbers, but the exact target demographic that football clubs are going to be talking to. But yet today, with all of this change over the last 7 or 8 years, it's incredible to see how clubs are still measured when it comes to their digital performance. Chris, would you like to tell us what your bosses look for out of China? One stat, what's the most important metric for them? Weibo followers. So how, with all of that change, all of that innovation, is Weibo followers still the most important metric? Doesn't really make any sense. Clubs, organizations, players use a Weibo figure to stand up at conferences and talk about how much better they are than the people next to them. They put it in commercial presentations, and it's designed to demonstrate popularity in market. But in reality, there are very, very few case studies of how a Weibo following is converted into revenue, is converted into partnership success, is converted into something tangible that you can track. So it's an outdated metric. So it's not at all helped by the fact that this huge population figure tends to blind people when they think about China. This 1.4 billion myth, as I like to call it, there are not 1.4 billion football fans or sports fans, or let alone people that have any awareness of what sports is in China. So when you talk about a number like 5 million Weibo followers or 100,000 WeChat followers, it's not a percentage of 1.4 billion. It's in fact way smaller than that. You cut that figure in half straight away with the urban population, meaning people with access to high-speed internet, higher education, higher disposable income, and some awareness of, let's say, overseas culture. According to the latest Nielsen surveys, there's about 432 million people that have some awareness of what sports is. Now, even that is not a sports fan. That is, Chris, we can all see you. We can all see you leaving. That is a football audience, someone who is aware of football, and we know how surveys work. It's not a fan. It's not someone that can be tracked. It is a big number designed to be used in presentations like this. If you go down to a slightly more defined metric, there's just over 100 million actual Weibo followers of football accounts in China. But that still doesn't take into account this follower who supports 10 different teams and is also following the CSL and 3 clubs. So that's not even a clear metric. If you go even further, European football followers on Weibo is at 50 million. So really, there's not a clear number. The one I like to use is 100 million. You've heard Premier League talk about 300 million football fans in China. The number simply isn't possibly true. So if we use the 100 million metric, this is people that do have awareness, that are likely following a club, have a favorite player. This is your target audience. As a club, an organization, or an athlete, this is an audience that you have some hope of converting. So an average top 10 club on Weibo has about 2 million followers, which even if you look at it in perspective is tiny. On WeChat, that number is 25,000. So this is why you have a much bigger question, which is why on earth are people investing in China? Why is it that priority market? And it's not a case of the numbers. I had a club ask me recently, why should we be putting our marketing dollars into China instead of Nigeria? They have 6 million followers on Facebook in Nigeria, a much higher participation, and a football-crazy audience with some great players playing in Europe. They have a lot of advantages that China doesn't have. Well, the answer to most people is revenue, or potential revenue, but I like to take it even further, which is the average dollar per fan. Now, that number, over the next few years, could grow to ensure that China is the #1 market when looking at this metric in the world. So this, for a commercial team, for a performance marketing team, is really what you have to be focused on. You look at the market potential of China, you have crazy investment coming in from government level in all areas of the domestic sports industry, but it's really geared towards driving participation in football as a major priority. Yes, there's a lot of real estate investment, but their main end goal is hosting a World Cup, sure, but also driving participation. Digital payments are blowing this wide open. The speed of payment decision-making process means that the amount of money going into hobbies is directly tied to the growing middle class and the higher disposable income that this category has, meaning spending on things like entertainment, hobbies, pastimes, your favorite sports is going up and up and up. So who are these fans? If there's 100 million, who are these guys? Yes, there's huge potential, but we've got to look a little bit more deeply into who they actually are. They call themselves single dogs. Now, the origin of this phrase in China comes from the fact that you don't have a relationship with, let's say, a girlfriend or a boyfriend. If you're a football fan, you have a relationship with the sport, or a favorite player, or a favorite team. So it's an affectionate term for a hardcore Chinese football fan. And if you look at the viewing culture, it's a much more individual, personal relationship they have. Times of games are always at nighttime. Viewership is 90% from home, likely on a PC or on a mobile device. So this growing middle class we've already talked about means the amount of money going into the sport from the consumers is going up and up and up. So that average dollar value per fan should be higher than anywhere else in the world. A third are female. Now this is a crazy stat if you look at most audiences worldwide, and it really comes down to the fact that you have a unique viewing culture. You do not go to a bar with all of your friends and throw beer around in China. It's a much more family-friendly orientated viewing culture. They watch at home, they watch with 3 or 4 people, and it's an open culture. So the fact that the female population is much higher also means that a lot of spending decisions that are sitting with the female in a family or in a relationship are going into sports. Tech savvy, this is very important as WeChat, as Weibo innovate and continue to roll out new features. China is a market very quick to adopt these new functionalities. And just the stat, 70% of that core Chinese football audience are on social media, means communication lines are strong. So how should it work? Well, most people have the end goal being the follower number. But the way we like to look at it is that the follower is essentially just the start of the journey. There is zero value in having a follower on Weibo who never looks at your account, never sees your content, and never has any chance of converting into someone that's going to watch United play if they come to China. So it starts with the follower. It's very important what that percentage of content consumers are. If you have 100,000 on WeChat, it's very important that you're looking at a 30–40% consumption rate. Physical engagement then takes the fan to the next level, whether that's an interaction, a comment, a share. It means they're going through this pipeline. Call to actions then allow you to actually track it. It means there's a measurable end goal in place that will determine ROI. So this brings me nicely onto WeChat, which as far as I'm concerned is the most important platform when it comes to converting your fan base. You're never going to have the same numbers, never going to have the same figures that you do on other platforms, but it's a real number. It's a market where if you have 100,000 and you need to fill a stadium, you are going to use your WeChat audience to sell early bird tickets. It's very different. It's hit 1 billion monthly active users, which also throws people when they look at a much smaller follower base. But as we've seen over the last 2 days, WeChat wears many hats. It's a P2B communication platform. It's how you run your life. You've got a social wall. There's mobile payments throughout the course of the day. And there's literally an interaction on WeChat based on time, based on location, over a 24-hour period. So users are becoming way more selective about who and what and which brands and which celebrities they interact with. And WeChat gives them some level of security. They're much more picky about who they will follow on WeChat because they're literally interrupting their lives. They're sending them a push message on a daily basis. It's something that it's interrupting them. If they don't like your brand, they're not going to follow you. Whereas on Weibo, it's made up majority of passive followers. So a classic common misconception when it comes to WeChat is that it's a social network. It should not be treated as such. If you look at a club presentation of their global social media following, you'll have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Weibo, WeChat. It shouldn't be on the same slide. It doesn't make sense, and it throws people off. It's essentially a CRM platform. It's the only opportunity you have through an app, through a network, to directly target a fan. It's the equivalent of, let's say, a free membership in the West or a newsletter. You don't have millions and millions and millions of people receiving a club newsletter on a monthly basis. You have a much smaller fraction because they've already stepped up a category in terms of their engagement as a fan. We've already talked about that. So what's different about it? It is a private network. Content cannot go viral in the same way that it can on Weibo, but it means that the value of a share from an individual is infinitely higher than what it would be on Weibo. If I'm sharing a Soccerex photo on my wall, my direct user base who follow me will take that seriously. If I put it on Weibo, they pay no attention to it. P2P communication on Weibo is essentially a thing of the past. Push messages are very different to every other platform. Every other platform, you have an option whether or not you're going to receive that content. On WeChat, it's delivered to your screen. And product innovation. They very slowly but gradually roll out new features on a monthly basis. In 2018 alone, you've seen the rise of the WeChat mini program. You've seen WeChat gaming, you've seen in-game purchasing, and you've seen developments in the way that they advertise. And that's just in the last 4 months. So you've got to look at it as a content and a sales channel. It can't be one, or it has to be both. If it's just content, there's really no end goal apart from the fact that they're going to be consuming content, which they can do on a number of other platforms in China. And if it's just sales, you're not really building the relationship with them in the first place. So if we look at a few case studies, the UFC had their first Shanghai, or the first China event in November last year. As many of you will know, China is a very difficult ticketing market to come into as an international organization. So they, for the first 24 hours of their sales, they offered it only to the WeChat audience, and they sold 10% in 24 hours, which is the ICC will tell you, or any club who's tried to come and sell tickets, it's a long process and it's very, very difficult. The UFC eventually sold out their 13,000 tickets. China memberships. So Arsenal pioneered this two or 3 years ago. It's a way, again, of trying to convert that fan base, trying to turn it into digital dollars. Instead of just relying on big sponsorships coming out of regional deals, you're looking at your digital audience and going, how do we make some revenue from that, or how do we add some value to the follower? Well, China memberships is a great example of that. And over the last 3 years, I think Arsenal sold about 20,000, and it's being adopted as WeChat being the hub for that membership. And I'm sure over the next year, you'll see other clubs follow suit. Product campaigns, way outside of sports, on a much bigger level. Mini Cooper created and released 100 custom-made cars, and they sold them in, 5 minutes on WeChat. So rather than being a browsing-first audience, it's very clearly catered to, you have an engaged audience, you sell them and you market them a product, and they will buy it. Gaming. WeChat gaming is a relatively new trend. Tiao Yi Tiao, very simple jumping game. It's the #1 most played game at the beginning of this year, and it's how they really launched mini programs to the market. So what are these mini programs that I've been talking about? Most people view them as some form of short TV concept, but it's essentially an app, an iOS app built within the WeChat ecosystem with all of the same functionality, the only difference being it sits on a platform that every user in China is very, very familiar with using. So this is what a few of them look like. In terms of accessibility, this is your friend feed that I think on average a Chinese user checks something like 100 times a day. And it literally sits, your most frequent used apps sit at the top of that. That's the mini programs you're using, and it even gives you a mini program nearby. So people like Starbucks, who pioneered the loyalty program, if you're walking past a Starbucks, their mini program will flag. Adidas used the mini program to manage their loyalty base in China, and it works exactly the same way as an app would. Mobike, which is the #1 ride-sharing app in China, about 6 months ago switched and also launched a mini program as well as their iOS app, and 75% of their user base choose to access the product through the mini program. So it's the year of the mini program, and just one stat from here, usage per day has gone up 8 times in just the last 6 months. So how is this relevant for a club or an organization? Well, most clubs have a .cn. They have a China website, and this is expensive to run. You need an editorial team behind it. You're essentially investing to drive traffic to a website that your fan base are not familiar with. And the content is often static, and it's, as we heard earlier, it's just breaking news. A Chinese fan does not need to get breaking news about Arsenal from the arsenal.cn website. He's already got it from 7 or 8 different apps. So having this website is essentially a cost center which doesn't have any return. So a lot of clubs are looking at how do they incorporate a website or an app into a much more basic, more user-friendly mini program. So we surveyed Hupu Sports, who are here today, the #1 football forum in China. We did a quick survey last week just for this presentation to try and work out whether there's any correlation between what the fans are saying and WeChat usage. So to back up the touch points throughout the day, the majority of the fans surveyed basically use WeChat all day. They don't have a specific time, they don't use it just before bed, and they don't use it in the morning. There's touch points throughout the day. Content formats. China has changed from being a sort of text and image-based format, and it's progressed to a much more rich media, long-form storyline approach. So WeChat is one of the few platforms where you're telling a story through rich media. It's not just a long article, you're incorporating image, graphic, GIF, and video into one content piece. This is clearly a preference for the China audience at the moment. WeChat Commerce. As we've talked about before, it's not a platform where people browse content. They don't go shopping on WeChat. Yes, there are Weidian, there are shops popping up, but you will go there for a specific reason. So if you look at the sometimes answer, more than 50% of people will buy if they've been targeted with a product. And that number's going up and up. Fan memberships, there's very, very few clubs that offer this at the moment, but there's clearly a market for it, with 30% of fans saying they'd buy it outright. They just want another touch point with their club that offers them some value rather than just pushing content and being a one-way conversation. And then for the other 60%, that would be depending on price and depending on content. And then finally, the football subscription. This has been a battle raging over the last 2-3 years as Supersports, Le Sports, PPTV, Tencent have tried to put premium content behind a paywall. And in year one, it was very, very difficult. And it led to what we have today, which is a sub-licensing forum of multiple rights going to different platforms. Le Sports tried and failed to pioneer the all-inclusive rights model, which has led to them no longer existing. And today we have a sort of communal effort by all broadcasters to try and put premium rights content behind a paywall. So today that battle is still going strong, but this number has changed a lot. The fact that 50% of these football audiences are willing to pay for, let's say, to watch their favorite team is a big win so far. But if you just look at the two platforms we've talked about so far, you've got Weibo and WeChat. There's a nice fly that's enjoying this. You're really only targeting the two opposite ends of the spectrum. You've got Weibo with the sort of mass audience, casual, passive football fans, and you have WeChat at the opposite end with your most engaged. These are the guys that you want to convert. So there's a pretty big gap in the middle. So I want to talk about 3 platforms today. Some of them have come up before, but we'll go into a little bit more detail, which is new audiences, new demographics per platform, different content formats suited to different platforms, and then obviously a very unique positioning for the 3. So Dongqiudi, this is the best and only real football vertical app in China, meaning you don't have huge audiences. You only have, 3 million monthly active users, but that is the 3 million people who you're directly competing for as a football club. That is your top 1 or top 5%, as it says here. The difference being it's an app for the fans, by the fans. It incorporates forums, it incorporates official content releases from rights holders, and it has, most importantly, direct conversion into e-commerce and into new followers on other platforms. You don't have the same kind of competition between Weibo and WeChat, Tencent and Alibaba as you do with some of these other platforms. This is what it looks like. The news feed being very much a sort of rotating feed of sports content, and then this is the official AFC account pushing much more in-depth analytical editorial content. Douyin, at the moment, is the viral platform in China. Whether this will be around next year, who knows? But right now, teams need to act fast when it comes to using and taking advantage of some of these. It's 15 seconds. If you've seen any viral video on any social media network overseas from China, it's likely been cut from Douyin. There's 1 billion daily views, and it literally just has 15-second UGC short-form content. The difference being it's very easy to use. Swipe-based mechanic is incredibly popular with millennials. It has a higher, more educated audience, majority from tier 1 and 2 cities, and a very high female audience. Again, looking at conversion, it supports direct sales to Tmall and even a direct follower button for Weibo. So there's dual benefits to using this platform. This is a couple of examples. So we've got Adidas Neo using a couple of their KOLs to release just a fun short-form content piece, not an advert, literally just something that's going live. And you have Juventus producing a piece of content for China that they would never do anywhere else in the world. This is Jay, their mascot, dancing to a Chinese song. This was one of their I think, best performing content piece over the last 6 months. That, for sure, no one would ever use on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat. Toutiao, Jinren Toutiao is essentially aggregated news of headlines in your content category. So it's a bit more personalized, but it has a much wider entertainment audience. So you're not going to be talking about what goes on the pitch all the time. It's a much more looking at players' lives, what happens behind the scenes, funny content, crazy content, the kind of stuff that you target young audiences with. But yet, it's 120 million daily active users. These are not numbers where you can treat these 3 platforms just like another app. there's got to be a much more diverse platform strategy than just Weibo and WeChat. So there's a kind of trend that's been going on over the last year is entertainment comes first, meaning that we don't have this standalone sports or even football category which is untouched. We're a very small part of a much, much bigger entertainment audience, meaning your content, if you're a football club, if you're an organization, is competing with Korean TV dramas, Chinese reality TV shows, athletes, actors, you name it. We're trying to compete for a very limited amount of a Chinese user's attention span with something that, yes, is a hobby of theirs, but they also have 10 others. So we're seeing a lot of cross-category, a lot of collaboration between brands from different categories, which coming together turns it into a bit more of an entertainment property. So Mobike we've already talked about. On practically a monthly basis, they roll out a collaboration, which they've done with Disney, with Nike, with Olema, all designed to try and gear their followers into something fun. So they do routes throughout the city, they release Hongbao, and this essentially drives up their user base. Tencent, from an entertainment focus, partnered up with the Table Tennis Federation and created a huge celebrity entertainment property. Now, if either of those two had tried to release this event separately, they would have struggled to sell tickets. But as the day one tickets sold out in seconds, in 72 seconds after launch. So coming together creates a property that has much more value than just a sports-only event. And probably the best example of this in the last 3 months was Nike inviting Wang Junkai, arguably top 5 most famous sort of celebrity at the moment in China, young, urban style. They invited him out to Beaverton to create his own unique shoe or sneaker. When this dropped, it had 5.2 million shares in the first day. Now, we work for Nike. They do not get 5.2 million shares on a normal shoe, even some of the big releases. This kind of crossover is something that we'll see more and more and more. It drives both revenue, interest, and it puts the crossover brings it to the attention of the wider media. So what are these 2018 takeaways, if we just have to summarize before we finish? Weibo followers absolutely do not determine success in this market. If anything, the opposite. You want to be looking at percentages of engagement. What is that readership? And Weibo are now restricting readership. It's becoming much more like Facebook, where you have to pay in order to have all of your followers see a piece of content. Secondly, as a new metric, that dollar value per fan is something that I think most organizations, brands, or clubs should be looking at specific to this market, because it's going to be what differentiates China from everywhere else in the world. And in that same vein, WeChat will be one of the most, if not the most important platform in terms of achieving that goal. Clubs need to be looking at new platforms, so leveraging, let's say, the likes of the 3, but there will be more, and it may not be that the 3 that I've just talked about will be as relevant in 6 months' time. When we do a presentation or a pitch to a new club, if they looked at that same presentation 3-4 months later, there may be multiple areas that have changed, which again backs up how fast China's digital landscape changes. And then finally, just bearing in mind that you're an entertainment-first property. You're not just designed to tell all of the news that is coming out from on the pitch. But the final question to take away, which I'm not going to answer for you, it is really the key to success in this market, which is off the back of government investment, President Xi's vision for a very strong domestic sports market, is what are you doing to support that development of football in this market? And if you answer that question, everything else will fall into place. Just a couple of an example that I think is very important being 100 million kids under the age of 6. How are they going to grow up? Are they going to grow up into a very strong sport or football culture? Are they going to grow up into an esports world? Or are they going to be very financial and business-minded? The culture of football in China is in its infancy. It's very, very difficult to change that. So the efforts of all of these clubs that we've heard, doing a soccer camp for 100 people, doing partnerships that really only affect a very small amount of people, they need to have a much wider vision and look at how do you scale that. Because you're not going to change the culture of football in China by coaching 100 kids or 10 coaches. You've got to look at how does that apply to an entire region, or how do you work with the CFA, or the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Sports, to try and support their goal. And finally, how does a parent know how to teach his kid if they didn't grow up in that culture? So it needs a lot of help from schooling, from the system, and from the international sports world. So this is how essentially collectively the 1,000 people in this room can actually make a difference to that next generation. Thank you very much.